Hi there everyone and welcome back to my channel After Dark Coffee and Crime. I hope you are all doing well. This is my next podcast and this podcast is on the Grenfell Tower fire. Now, the Grenfell Tower is a tower block that is 24 stories and it was a residential tower. And unfortunately, due to a technical fault with a fridge freezer, the tower caught fire. It took ablaze very, very quickly. The fire service couldn't keep control of it, and sadly, 72 people lost their lives. Obviously, with all my content, I do like to give you guys a content warning because the information we are talking about is upsetting, and this may be upsetting for some, especially if you have experienced a fire or lost someone to a fire. Some of the content just may not be suited for everyone. So if that is likely to cause upset, please do click out of this podcast and hop into another one. All the information that I have discussed in here is information that is available to you on the internet. Sources such as articles from the newspaper, articles from the actual news, information from the public inquiry and news sources. That being said, let's get started. I hope that you will be joining me in the live premiere chat where we will be chatting together as the podcast is aired. If not, you'll be watching on replay, so make sure you hit the like button, the subscribe button, and more importantly, the notification button so that you don't miss when the podcasts go live on premiere. That's it, and I will see you on the other side of the podcast.
An unprecedented incident. In my 29 years of being a firefighter, I have never ever seen anything of this scale. Based on the level of resource that was needed at this fire, we declared this a major incident very early this morning.
The Grenfell Tower was a high-rise social housing block in Kensington which caught fire on June the 14th in 2017. Now, the Grenfell Tower had actually been built back in 1977, but the cladding that was used, which caused the fire to spread very quickly, was added after the original construction and was added between the years 2012 and 2016. It was a 24-storey building and it consisted of 129 residential flats. Many residents were actually sleeping when the fire broke out early that morning. Now, it broke out just before 1 a.m. on June the 14th, 2017, after an electrical fault in one of the residents' fridge freezer. This triggered a small kitchen fire on the 4th floor of this building. Now, obviously 999 call was sent out to call for help.
Sorry, a fire where?
Flat 16 Grenfell Tower. In the fridge.
Right, hang on.
Flat 16 Grenfell Tower.
Flat 16, and what's the postcode?
W11 1TG.
W111T for
1TG.
Tango.
Yeah, but can you quick please?
Yeah, would you just, I have to get the address. Okay,
Flat 16 Grenfell Tower, W11 1TG.
The fire brigade are on their way. Are you outside?
Yeah, I'm outside.
Yeah, well, the fire engines are on their way. Just tell me how many floors you got there.
It's the 4th floor.
Right,
Alright,
okay.
quick.
They're on their
It's
way
burning.
already. Yes, I know it's burning, but they are on their way. You've only just called, as long as you're okay. Yeah?
Okay.
And firefighters arrived at the scene very, very quickly, within minutes actually. And even though they arrived very quickly, the first responders could see that the fire started to spread quite rapidly, and within around 15 minutes after the fire had broken out, the flames had reached the outside cladding of the building. Now, at the time of the fire, it was suspected, but it has now been confirmed, that the cladding is what contributed to the rapid spread of the fire on the building. The fire just completely spread really quickly, and we know back then that the reason residents didn't evacuate from their accommodation is that they were told to stay in their flats, and this was the protocol they had at the time, which is known as the stay put policy. And the stay put policy is done for safety reasons, to stop everyone exiting the building at the same time. The apartments should be built in a way that people can be safely contained in their flats, while the fire in the location that it is in is dealt with. So obviously, as residents were calling the control room for help, they were being told to stay put, and that was because that was the protocol. Even though the fire was spreading rapidly, I don't think anyone could have anticipated or believed what would actually happen and how quickly that it would happen. Now, the official advice to the residents in the tower was only changed almost 2 hours later, and it was too late for many of the residents that had become trapped in the tower. Sadly, 72 people perished in the Grenfell Tower fire. Of those victims, 70 died on the scene and another 2 died later in the hospital. Those who died came from 19 different countries worldwide. There were young victims who lost their lives in the Grenfell Tower fire, but the youngest victim was actually an unborn baby called Logan Gomez, who died in his mother's womb because of the smoke. He was one of the 19 children who died in this tragedy. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the timeline of what happened during the fire, from obviously the calls being made to the fire service. So a minute by minute breakdown of exactly how the tragedy unfolded on the 14th of June was included in the final report in the public inquiry. So I'm going to go through those now. So at 12:54, Bihelu Kebede, who was 45 at the time, he was the man that lived on the 4th floor in flat 16. He is asleep when his smoke alarm goes off and wakes to find white smoke billowing from behind his fridge freezer. He calls 999 to report the fire. Now at 12:59, the first firefighters arrive on the scene, and they are led by the London Fire Brigade Watch Manager Michael Dowden, a firefighter from around 13 years, who sees an orange glow coming from the window of flat 16. So that's where it all started, in flat 16 with that fridge freezer. At 1:06, Mr. Dowden notes that the fire had breached the window of the flat. He later tells the inquiry this isn't uncommon in high-rise fires, and therefore it isn't too concerning, and he wasn't concerned by that at the time. Now, at 1:09, the fire in flat 16 breaks to the exterior cladding of the building and starts to climb on the east facade rapidly. At 1:14 a.m, firefighters enter the kitchen of flat 16 for the first time. At 1:16, Mr. Dowden has become uncomfortable about the way that this fire is burning, and he later says he couldn't understand why it wasn't being suppressed, as a breathing apparatus team was also inside fighting it from the inside of the building. At 1:19 a.m, Mr. Dowden notices that the cladding is alight, and he would later tell the inquiry he fell out of his comfort zone and helpless as this fire took hold. At 1:21, Dr. Naomi Yuan Lee, who is in flat 195 on the 22nd floor with her cousin Lydia, calls 999 after she smells something that smells like burning plastic while she was in bed using her phone. At 1:25 a.m, 56-year-old Dennis Murphy, who died during the fire, makes the first 999 call to report smoke coming into a flat. He is number 111 and on the 14th floor. His son Peter told the inquiry he also called his family to tell them he was trapped and that he was struggling to breathe. At 1:26 a.m, Metropolitan Police declares a major incident and the residents are still being told to stay in their flats. And this is the stay put policy that I mentioned earlier. So the stay put strategy is a standard guide for high-rise blocks, and it assumes that the fire, like I said before, will be contained in one room or on a floor at least, allowing firefighters to tackle the flames, allowing residents to stay in their home, and obviously this in turn will then stop everyone trying to get down the stairwells, blocking the stairwells, preventing the firemen doing what they need to do. So there is a theory behind it, but obviously in this case this was not the right decision, but they were not to know that at the time. By 1:27 a.m, the fire has reached the roof and it starts to spread horizontally. Fire chiefs believe only the cladding from the outside is burning, but that it is still controllable internally. So they're deceived into thinking that they're only seeing it burning from the outside and that it's not burning from inside as well. Mr. Dowden increases the number of pumps being used to 20, and this is at 1:29, having escalated from 4 to 6 to 8 to 10 and to 15 between 1:13 a.m. and 1:28 a.m. He says that he is becoming increasingly concerned. The amount of pumps is used by firefighters to measure the severity of the fire, and so obviously they're upping that all the time, and obviously this fire at the time is not getting in control either. At 1:30 in the morning, Miriam El-Gawari is the first person to call 999, reporting that the fire is penetrating a flat. She is with her mum Esla, and she is in flat 196 on the 22nd floor. Miriam's brother Ahmed Al-Ghari has said that he was on the phone to them later that night and they were telling him, that they couldn't breathe. Sadly, Miriam and Esla had died that night. At 1:31 a.m, after the firefighter David Badillo tells Mr. Dowden they need more resources, the watch manager increases the pumps to 25, and by this time 110 of the 297 occupants have escaped as the fire starts to spread to the north elevation of the tower. Some residents stayed put as advised and some residents did not. Now at 1:42 in the morning, the London Ambulance Service declares a significant incident, and a report by fire protection expert David Barbara-Lane states the residents should have been told to evacuate by this time at the latest, but the stay put policy has remained in place. At 1:45 a.m, the first police helicopter arrives at the scene. At 1:50, Mr. Dowden hands over incident command to station manager Andrew Walton, who had been listening to the incident on the radio on a standby shift. By this point, 168 of the 297 occupants have escaped, but the firefighters don't know the numbers at that stage. Now at 1:58, Mr. Walton is still trying to inform firefighters that he is in charge of the incident when he sees DAC Andrew O'Lowin, who is 2 ranks above him, making big steps towards him. Now Mr. O'Lowin, who's been a firefighter since 1989, had heard 25 pumps mentioned on his radio and knew it was an exceptional situation and that something very serious was going on. He is surprised that there were not more high-ranking officers at the scene already. So he asked Mr. Dowden how many people were still in the building, but he doesn't have a number. He says many people have already come out from the lower floors, and Mr. O'Lowin estimates that there's still between 100 to 200 people in there. Obviously, at that point, they didn't know the condition, the age, the ambulatory or the health issues of any of the people, the residents that were living in there, and so getting people down through smoke-logged staircases was going to be a challenge, and obviously he's trying to balance all of that and decide on what is the best policy, explaining why he felt the stay put advice would be best for some people in the building. Now by 2 a.m. flames travel across the north and east elevations of the tower, and they start to spread to the top of the building, diagonally across the face of the building, affecting flats in the southeast and northwest corners. At 2:04 a.m, Group Manager Richard Welsh declares himself incident commander and increases the number of pumps to 40, not knowing that Mr O'Lowan has already assumed command. So there seems to have been a bit of a lack of communication between them. At 2:11, Mr Welsh realises Mr O'Lowan is on site and apologises for taking control, fills him in on what he has done. Now, Mr O'Lowan thanks him and says he is happy with the actions taken. At 2:15, Senior Operations Manager Joanne Smith, who's 23 years experience, arrives at the London Fire Brigade's control room and receives a briefing. At 2:20, flames start to spread to the south elevation. Between now and 2:50, the control room receives 35 emergency calls from or on behalf of the trapped Grenfell residents. One was from Marcio Gomez in flat 183 on floor 21, who was trapped with his wife, who was 7 months pregnant, and his 2 daughters. Mr. Gomez, his wife and daughters survived the blaze, but his son Logan was stillborn in hospital as a result of the smoke. Now at 2:23, a Met Police operator calls London Fire Brigade's control room to tell them that a caller is trapped on the 23rd floor and their phones have cut off. One of the London Fire Brigade's control room officers has responded by saying, "I think they are trapped everywhere." At 2:26, the London Ambulance Service declares a major incident, and at 2:35 a.m, the stay put advice is revoked. Miss Smith had been listening in to 2 long-running emergency calls, one of which was with the El Wahabi family in flat 182 on floor 21. The El Wahabi family consisted of 52-year-old Abdul Aziz, his wife Fozia Aziz, and their 3 children, 21-year-old Yazin, 16-year-old Nurhuda, and 8-year-old Mahidi. Now, Miss Smith, who is listening into the call, says it is becoming clear the situation was getting worse in terms of smoke and heat, and she is increasingly uncomfortable with the stay put policy. The London Fire Brigade control room decides that they're going to revoke that stay put advice, and then they tell the occupants, who are calling 999, to leave the tower at all costs, and it is a matter of life and death. Mr. O'Lowan is still in charge of the scene at the Grenfell Tower. He later tells the inquiry he wasn't informed of this change for some time, so he was confused by it once he was informed. Now, at 2:44, the London Fire Brigade Assistant Commissioner Andy Rowe takes over incident command from O'Lowan. He later tells the inquiry that Mr. Lowan had not revoked the stay put advice at the time. Mr. Rowe, who joined the London Fire Brigade as a firefighter in 2002, had been made AC in January 2017. So he says he knew as soon as he arrived on the scene that there had been a complete building system failure to contain this blaze. He could see the whole tower from the 3rd floor upwards was alight. At 2:47, Mr. Rowe officially revokes that stay put advice, and he said in his testimony that he didn't recall being told that the control room had already stopped giving that advice, and that he had made the decision solely because he could see the fire had spread in all directions, resulting in a total failure of compartmentation, which is a safety feature designed to keep a fire in the region of its origin. At 2:50 a.m. the fire then spreads horizontally across the south elevation to the top of the building. At 3 a.m. the fire then spreads across the west elevation of the tower from north to south. At 3:20 Mr. Rowe chairs the first tactical coordination group meeting, and this is attended by the representatives of the Metropolitan Police, the LAS, and the Royal Borough of Kensington. And at this stage 100 people are believed to be trapped in the tower, and it is understood at this point in time 3 people have actually died. At 4:02 fires on the south and west elevation start to converge at the top of the southern corner of the west face. Rescue efforts across the building continue for hours. At 8:07 Elpidio Bonifacio is a partially sighted retiree and becomes the last survivor who leaves the tower when 2 firefighters rescue him from his flat on the 11th floor. Now, Mr. Bonifacio, whose wife of 42 years was at work, later tells the inquiry he had actually lost all hope and was ready to die before firefighters came and supported him down the staircase. Now, I can remember watching this unfold. I can remember seeing the tower was completely alight. I can remember seeing people filming at the base of the tower, at people shouting. I can remember the people who were in one of the flats at the top, on the top floor there, and they had posted a video. I think it was on their Facebook, and sadly, you know, you kind of see that video, you hear their voices, and then you sadly hear that they didn't survive this, obviously because they were told to stay put, and then they couldn't actually escape. And when you see those things and hear those things, it's just absolutely devastating. And I just can remember just watching the whole thing unfold. As you can see, you know, even from the start of the fire, from the first call, the fire was spreading rapidly within 15 minutes. So, you know, that first call was put out just before 1 a.m. in the morning, and by 1:06 it had breached the window. At 1:09 the fire is breaking out onto the external cladding, and we learn as well that at some point they don't realise that it's burning from the inside as well as the outside, and I'm guessing because some of those floors didn't yet have personnel on the floor to be able to relay that back to them on the ground outside. And so if you don't think it's burning from the inside as well as the outside, and you think you've got it contained on the lower floor, it's difficult to predict where this is going. And, you know, I can understand why they stuck to the policy for as long as they did, but there were times that they didn't feel comfortable with it, and it's at that point, you know, should they have addressed that and gotten more advice on that? I don't know. I wasn't there. It's just a thought that crossed my mind. But at that point, if you're starting to feel uncomfortable with it, something's telling you something isn't right. So we looked at the stay put policy as I was going through those timings with you and the issues around that. Now, obviously with the cladding, that was known to be a big issue, and in time we got to learn quite a bit about the cladding. Now, there is quite a bit of information behind cladding, how it works, how it's structured, and there is a lot of information out there, and some of it is quite scientific and a bit beyond me, but I kind of found information that might help to kind of understand how the cladding itself actually failed. And obviously we know some of the decisions at the time that they added the cladding was to purchase the cheaper cladding on the belief that it would obviously do what it was supposed to do. So the article, this was by the BBC, had said that there was 9 things that we didn't know about cladding, or that we now know about the cladding that we didn't know. And I thought it was quite interesting, and I thought that it was a simplified way to share that with you. So cladding panels made from plastic and aluminium. They were what was installed on the sides of the Grenfell Tower, and the aim of this was to make it warmer and drier. But we know now that the cladding has been blamed for helping the flames spread so quickly when this fire happened, which resulted in those 72 deaths. Hundreds of thousands of people today are still living in buildings with similar cladding, and there was recently a fire that was using this cladding, and it should have been removed, at the time of the tower when they realised what was happening, and they're saying that it should be removed, and it's going to be an enormous cost, resulting in a crisis in building safety. But if you're going to have these buildings and rent them out, you have to deal with that because you need to make your tenants safe. So what they learned during the inquiry is that the type of cladding they used burns easily. The big concern is about the type of cladding, and this is called the aluminium composite material, or ACM. It is made from polyethylene plastic sandwiched between two very thin sheets of aluminium. Now, France-based Arconic Architectural Products called its version of the product Rainabond PE and sold it to big building projects all over the world. And it is now known that this product is highly flammable. The cladding consistently failed fire tests for 12 years before Grenfell Tower happened. So back in 2005, Arconic commissioned tests in France to see how Rainabond would perform in a fire when it was installed in two standard ways, known as rivet cladding systems and cassette systems. Rivet systems are simply installed straight onto mountain brackets with rivets. In cassette systems, the cladding is folded into box shapes like old style cassette tapes to hide the fixings. Crucially, it was the cassette system that was used for the Grenfell Tower. When the cassette version of Rainabond PE was tested, it failed to complete the test. In the standard European fire test, the results were classified from A1, which is best, and F to mean worst. The cassette version was given a rating of E. The folding appeared to allow flaming pools of plastic to form. The version was to be tested again in 2011, 14 and 15, and each time the rating was an E. Even the better performing rivet version only managed a Class C in more recent testing. It didn't meet building standards in England, so at this point they shouldn't have used it. The Bible for construction in England is approved by Document B. It sets out the fire performance standards for all buildings. Only products with a rating of B in the European fire test can be used on tall buildings above 18 metres, and the Rainabond cladding with Class E fell short of that required standard, and yes, it does. England has its own system of fire test ratings, and the best rating is Class O, 0, which is acceptable instead of the European standard, but Rainabond PE's French manufacturer had never put this cladding through the relevant tests, and this was brought up during the public inquiry. There were other ways to meet the regulations, including testing a design in a full-scale mock-up, but that didn't happen at Grenfell Tower. Arconic now says it should have done. Now, Arconic has been accused of misleading the British Standards Board. So test results are commercially sensitive, so a specialist body, the British Board of Agreement, so the BBA, assesses them and issues product certificates. The BBA decided the evidence from the more successful European tests carried out on the Arconic cladding meant it may be regarded as having met British standard, but the board was never shown the Class E ratings for the cassette version of the cladding and knew nothing about them until the BBC did an investigation in 2018. Arconic's president in France, Claude Schmitt, was forced to admit at the inquiry that this would have misled anyone reading the certificate, including British architects. Now, they say that the Grenfell Tower was predicted a decade before. In 2007, Arconic marketing manager Gerard Sontag attended a talk given by a consultant, Fred Roderick Pole, who gave a dramatic warning of the risk of aluminium composite material cladding. He said it had the same fuel power as a 19,000 litre truck of oil. But he went further, and Pole repeatedly asked what would happen if only one building made out of PE is on fire and kills 60 to 70 people. And as we know, this is the exact circumstances of the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. Mr. Sontag's account of the presentation has been uncovered by the inquiry, and this included in it evidence of what the company knew and when. And the company was aware of a towering inferno warning following fires in the Middle East. So back in 2013, a report was done by the BBC on a worrying series of fires that was occurring in the Middle East that blamed ACM cladding on several producers. Arconic noticed employees circulated an email that they'd received from a sales manager working for a competitor, Richard Greater, at 3A Composites, who described cladding which had been sold as fire resistant, which burned like paper. It was a cheat, Greater concluded. Arconic's UK sales manager Deborah French was asked at the inquiry why not a health warning was attached to the product, and at the time she said the level of risk wasn't so obvious. But the cladding sales continued despite the risk. So the company's UK sales manager, Deborah French, told the inquiry British buyers were more likely to request Rainabond PE and fit the cladding as cassettes, the variant which resulted in the poor fire tests, as they allowed for a cleaner appearance with the fixings hidden from view. In France, there was a move towards a fire retardant version, but not in Britain. The company's technical manager, Claude Weil, had been instrumental in commissioning the fire tests. He warned colleagues and even clients about the results, even that they should be kept very confidential, and the sales continued. In the minutes of the meeting in 2011, Mr. Well wrote that the cladding has had a bad behaviour exposed to fire, but we can still work with the national regulations as we are not as restrictive. Since the fire, the company has stopped selling Rainabond, but it agrees it is simply the manufacturer of a raw material supplied to the specialist fabricators who make cladding systems. Arconic says it can't possibly know the end uses for its products, and it is for the designers to check that it meets the building regulations. Kind of sounds like passing the buck. However, an email had been sent in May 2013 by sales manager Deborah French to a client which gave a completely different impression. She said the company could control and understand the type of cladding that was being used in building projects because it only worked with a very small group of approved fabricators, so obviously telling them what they wanted to hear. She also said that they were able to follow what type of project was being designed and developed, and wrote, then offer the right Rainabond specification. When she was questioned about it, she claimed she had not been telling the truth when writing the email. Bit late now. The company knew that it was selling to Grenfell, so the inquiry has evidence that Deborah French, who led the sale of the cladding for Grenfell Tower, knew it was for a public residential building. So in one mouthful, they're saying they couldn't possibly know where it was, what it would be used for, and therefore it's down to the architecture. And then in the next breath, she's telling people, we can do this, that, and provide this. But actually, that's not the truth. And she knew what this cladding was being used for, which is just shocking. In January 2013, 4 years before the fire, she was sent an artistic rendering of what Grenfell might look like after completion of the work. But she maintained through the days of evidence that she had no technical knowledge and did not get involved in the design of the projects, passing the buck. So we know, and the Grenfell Tower inquiry confirms, that the faulty electrical connection in that fridge freezer is what started the blaze. Now, again, I'm not a fridge freezer electrician specialist. I don't know how these things work and operate. However, there is a sort of simple explanation, and I'll try and do my best. It's not a scientific way, but it's just enough to give you an indication of what caused the fire to happen. The fire that engulfed the Grenfell Tower probably started due to an overheated wiring in a fridge freezer, and this has been said by an expert. Now, John Glover, the expert, told the inquiry that the blaze may have been caused by a connector in a hot point FF175BP fridge freezer in flat 16 of the block, and this was due to a poor crimp connection. And that just basically means that these wires were not gripped as tightly as they should have been, which then caused the connector to overheat. The public inquiry was shown a picture of the connector, which had been recovered from a small electrical compartment at the bottom of the fridge freezer, and the inquiry was told that the investigators also found 3 inches of damaged wire in one of the bedrooms of the flat. The expert went on to say that he studied CT scans of the connector and found the spaces indicating the crimp was not nice and tight, and a probable cause of the fire is poor crimp connection. The overheating connector, in my opinion, was the first event that started burning the insulation on the wires that led to a short circuit. The overheating of the crimp starts the fire, it overheats, it glows, and then it ignites. Now, the manufacturer for Whirlpool and the government carried out their own investigations into the model, but in May this year they said there were no safety issues or need to recall the actual product. They said, Whirlpool wanted to reassure people who own their products, that they wanted to reassure owners that the products that they have are safe and they can continue to use them as normal. There have been 2 separate investigations into this model, and both investigations are independent and found no evidence of any fault with the model, and confirmed that it is fully complied with all safety requirements, and they are committed to continuing to assist with the inquiry to enable investigations on all potential origins and causes of the fire and the spread. So, as you can see, there is a lot of information around the construction of Grenfell Tower with the cladding, how the cladding is made, how the cladding is connected, and what goes on into testing the cladding to make sure it is safe. Same with the fridge freezer connectors. So I hope the bits of information that I've given you are in depth enough to understand what we need to know, but not too sciencey that it's too much, because there is a lot of science behind this, and the inquiry document will be massive for you to go through, but some people like to do that. So what I would say is if you want to get into the full details of everything that has been said in the inquiry, definitely go and find the public inquiry. You can just Google it and it will come up on the government website, and you can go in and access the reports there. The Grenfell Tower was a tragedy. So many lives were lost, and I can remember when people were looking for missing loved ones, and I just remember how heartbreaking this was at the time, and there were so many important things raised in this, and you know, there's always going to be finger pointing and blame, and I agree with some of the things that I've read, that, you know, the fire brigade themselves are not to blame for this. They were following their protocols, and I did see interviews of them leading up to the inquiry that they were streaming, and I kind of felt it was just blame the fire brigade, and you know, they were implementing the policies to the best of their knowledge and abilities at the time, and obviously they can't know what is going on with the cladding if they didn't know that it was an issue. But it was a tragic incident and so many lives were lost. So I'm going to end this podcast now with a list of the names. You can see them on the screen above me, of the victims who sadly lost their lives, and I will leave that on with some music at the end there. But that concludes this podcast for today, and I look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care of yourselves and each other, and if you see something, say something. Take care, guys, and I will be back next week. Bye for now.